Imagine you're watching a live stream of a man climbing a mountain. The man is inexperienced and visibly struggling, but as he's reaching the summit, he slips and falls thousands of feet to his death, all while live streaming, traumatizing his audience for life. This is exactly what happened to Tetsu Shiohara. Tetsu Shiohara was not just a name that floated through the online forums of Japan. He was a figure of intrigue, mystery, and ultimately, tragedy. At 47, Tetsu was a man who had lived a life full of trials and tribulations, his path winding through loneliness and unfulfilled dreams. Born on the island of Shikoku, Tetsu had always been somewhat of an enigma. To some, he was a Ronin student, a drifter, wandering through life without a clear destination. To others, he was a humble and determined learner, a man who never gave up, despite the odds stacked against him. Tetsu's life took him across the ocean to America, where he pursued his studies with fervor. But when he returned to Japan, reality hit him hard. Despite his efforts, he failed multiple attempts to pass the bar exam, a fact that only deepened the chasm between him and his family. His father, a respected local professor, and his mother, a woman admired in their community, watched as their son retreated further into isolation. Tetsu had always been distant, but now he was alone, living in a small, cramped apartment, with only the flickering light of his computer screen to keep him company. It was in 2015 that Tetsu turned to the online world, where he found solace in live streaming. Behind the screen, he was no longer just Tetsu Shiohara, the failed student, the recluse. He became someone else. He shared his life with his viewers, who were more than just anonymous faces to him. They were his friends, his confidants. He never complained about his circumstances, even though they were far from ideal. He had no job, no friends, and only a distant relationship with his family. But on his streams, he was generous with his time, talking to anyone who would listen, finding comfort in the virtual connections he made. One of these connections was with a woman named Satan, an attractive figure in the live streaming community who broadcasted lifestyle videos. She and Tetsu formed a bond, interacting frequently online. In 2017, they even climbed Mount Fuji together, an experience that Tetsu cherished. Though it's unclear if they ever met in person again, Satan continued to encourage him to climb, pushing him to find purpose in the mountains that towered above Japan. Tetsu's love for climbing grew, but so did his battles. Diagnosed with stage 4 colon cancer, he was a man on borrowed time. The survival odds were grim, just 7%. He was unemployed, living off financial support from his parents, and as he neared 50, the future seemed bleak. Yet, Tetsu wasn't one to wallow in despair. Instead, he threw himself into climbing, perhaps seeing it as a way to reclaim some sense of control, a way to fight back against the fate that had been dealt to him. Mount Fuji, Japan's tallest and most iconic peak, became his obsession. He reached its summit multiple times during the summer seasons, despite the warnings and risks that came with such climbs. To many, Fuji is more than just a mountain. It is a symbol, a sacred place where the spirit goddess Sakuya Hime is believed to reside. Legends say she watches over those who ascend the mountain, but in the case of Tetsu, many would later wonder if she had turned a blind eye to his final journey. The mountain itself stands at a staggering 12,389 feet, its trails welcoming to beginners during the summer months, but turning deadly as the season shifts. Officially, the climbing season runs from July to mid-September, when the weather is more forgiving and the trails are bustling with adventurers. Outside this window, however, the mountain transforms. Ice and snow blanket the slopes, turning what was once a manageable hike into a perilous endeavor. Climbing during the off-season without permission is strictly forbidden, a rule that is in place for good reason. The risks are real. Hypothermia, sudden weather changes, and fatal falls claim lives every year. But for Tetsu, these warnings seemed to hold little weight. He was determined, and perhaps that determination blinded him to the dangers ahead. On September 7th, 2019, just 3 days before the off-season began, Tetsu completed yet another climb of Mount Fuji. It would be his last successful ascent. The weather was on the brink of change, and as the off-season set in, the mountain's trails became a different beast altogether. Snow began to fall, the winds grew colder, and the once friendly paths turned treacherous. It was during this time that Tetsu began to contemplate a winter climb. A suggestion from a viewer in one of his live streams sparked the idea. "I'd like to see the view from Mount Fuji in the winter," they had commented, likely without realizing the gravity of their request. Tetsu's response was casual, almost dismissive. "Well, if it were now, it probably wouldn't be that cold. It's probably -3 or -4 degrees. It's at the top of the mountain, so I'll just go there quickly. I'll move forward without dying. I won't even feel cold." But beneath his nonchalant words, there was an acknowledgement of the danger. He mentioned death as if it were an afterthought, but the fact that he mentioned it at all was telling. Perhaps he knew, deep down, that what he was planning was reckless, even suicidal. Yet, something pushed him forward. Maybe it was the realization that he had little time left, that the cancer eating away at his body was a more immediate threat than the icy slopes of Mount Fuji. Or maybe it was a sense of denial, a refusal to accept that his life was slipping away, one climb at a time. As October approached, Tetsu made up his mind. He would climb Mount Fuji in the winter, despite knowing the risks. The trails would be closed, the mountain huts empty, and he would be alone with nothing but the biting wind and freezing temperatures for company. He wasn't an experienced winter climber. He had no technical skills and no proper gear, but none of that mattered to him. He was a man with nothing left to lose. And in his mind, this climb was a way to reclaim some sense of control, to prove to himself, and perhaps to the world, that he was still alive. On October 28, 2019, Tetsu set off for Tokyo, his destination being the 5th station of Mount Fuji, where the popular Yoshida Trail began. He planned to start his climb mid-morning, hoping to reach the summit quickly and descend before nightfall. But even as he set out, something seemed off. He posted online about feeling scared, sick even. As the bus neared the 5th station, he realized he was the only passenger left, a fact that only heightened his anxiety. At 10:30 a.m., he arrived at the 5th station and began his live stream. "Let's go to snowy Mount Fuji," he announced to his viewers, his voice carrying a mix of excitement and dread. But as he started up the trail, it was clear that he was woefully unprepared. He wasn't wearing a hat, and his gloves were neither windproof nor waterproof. His attire, a pair of casual jeans, light hiking boots, and a fleece jacket, was far from adequate for the conditions. And yet, he pressed on, determined to reach the summit. The trail was misty, the clouds hanging low, as if to warn him of the danger ahead. But Tetsu ignored the signs, his mind focused on the climb. He entered the Yoshida Trail at 10:42 a.m., disregarding the clear warnings that it was closed. The air was damp, the terrain slick, but so far, Tetsu had no problems. At least, none that he was willing to acknowledge. As Tetsu ascended, the trail became more treacherous. The mist thickened, the ground grew colder, and the once familiar paths turned into a maze of icy uncertainty. But Tetsu was determined, or perhaps too stubborn, to turn back. He kept climbing, one step at a time, his breath visible in the frigid air. Unbeknownst to his viewers, Tetsu was on a collision course with fate. What started as a simple suggestion from a viewer had now spiraled into something far more dangerous. And as he climbed higher, the stakes grew with every step. This was no longer just a climb. It was a battle, a test of will against the unforgiving forces of nature. And as Tetsu Shiohara neared the summit of Mount Fuji, the mountain had one final challenge in store for him, one that would forever etch his name in the annals of tragic history. As Tetsu continued his ascent, the cold crept deeper into his bones, and the idea of death became an ever-present shadow in his mind. It was as if the mountain itself whispered to him, reminding him of the precariousness of his situation. His plan was ambitious: reduce the typical 10-hour round trip to just over 6 hours by pushing himself to the limit. He knew he'd be returning in darkness, but for some reason, he didn't bring a headlamp or even a handheld torch. Was he planning to rely solely on his phone's light, or was he simply ignoring the looming danger? The truth was that Tetsu had no real experience with winter climbing. He admitted as much to his viewers, saying, "It's my first time, and it's a bit too challenging to summit a mountain at this time of year. It's my own fault. I'm not a seasoned veteran." Yet, even with this awareness, he pressed on, almost defiantly. "I'll try not to die. I think I'll be able to come back," he remarked, a line that seemed more like an attempt to convince himself than to reassure his audience. As he climbed over another warning sign, heading deeper into the snow-covered terrain, his breath became heavier, his steps more labored. Less than 30 minutes into the climb, he was already hungry, having left an energy bar at home to lighten the load. The altitude was taking its toll, and the thin air made every breath a struggle. A woman's voice from his live stream asked him about crampons, a vital piece of equipment for icy conditions. Tetsu's response was almost casual. He had forgotten them. His stubbornness kept him moving forward, but the mountain was relentless. By the time he reached the 6th station, the mountain huts were closed, as expected. Yet Tetsu seemed almost surprised, commenting that he'd have no food and would have to make do with his frozen green tea. As a seasoned summer climber of Mount Fuji, he must have known the huts would be closed. So why wasn't he better prepared? Perhaps he was in denial, or maybe he was so focused on the climb that he disregarded the obvious. With the sun steadily climbing higher, Tetsu knew he was behind schedule. Reaching the summit by 2 p.m. was crucial. Otherwise, he'd be descending in complete darkness. The thought of navigating icy slopes in pitch black with only a phone torch seemed reckless, but Tetsu wasn't deterred. He pressed on, his determination perhaps masking a growing sense of dread. As he broke through the low clouds, the snow-covered summit came into view. The sun was out, the skies were clear, and the mountain seemed almost welcoming. But the conditions were deceiving. Tetsu was sweating from the exertion and eager to reach the snow. By the time he arrived at the 7th station, it was 11:35 a.m. The altitude was taking a heavier toll on him, and his breathing had become labored. As he encountered a couple on the trail, their exchange was brief but telling. The man, clearly aware of the dangers, decided to turn back. Tetsu, however, kept moving forward, despite the clear signs that he was in over his head. The higher he climbed, the more treacherous the conditions became. The snow thickened, and the once clear path turned into a narrow, slippery track. Tetsu's hunger grew more intense, his energy waning with each step. Mountaineers can burn up to 700 calories an hour, even more in extreme conditions, and Tetsu had nothing but tea to sustain him. Still, he pushed on, driven by a mix of determination and perhaps desperation. By 1:19 p.m., Tetsu had reached the 8th station, completely alone. The trail was now fully covered in snow, transforming the landscape into something akin to a skiing resort. The guardrails and ropeways were buried under several feet of snow, and Tetsu began to slip more frequently. But he refused to be deterred, his confidence in his outdoor abilities seemingly unshaken. The trail ahead was unrecognizable, a world apart from the one just 50 or 60 meters below. At 1:50 p.m., the path became almost impassable without the right gear. It was completely exposed, with nothing to grab onto. One wrong step, and Tetsu knew he'd be in serious trouble. But he was so focused on reaching the summit that he ignored these dangers, continuing his climb despite the worsening conditions. By 2:15 p.m., the path was barely visible. Tetsu was now walking along 30-degree slopes, battling strong winds and losing feeling in his fingers. The frozen snow had created a narrow, walkable path, one that required precision and caution. But Tetsu was clearly struggling, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his mind clouded by exhaustion and the thin air. He was unsure if he was even on the right path, but he kept going, driven by some unseen force. At 2:30 p.m., Tetsu finally reached the path around the summit. He was relieved to have made it, but the victory was hollow. His fingers were numb, almost devoid of feeling, a dangerous sign in such conditions. But instead of seeking shelter, he continued to live stream, taking off his gloves to check his phone, despite the growing risk of frostbite. The paths along the summit were buried under more than 3 feet of snow in some places, forcing Tetsu to climb over frozen drifts with only loose rocks to steady himself. He frequently mentioned slipping, warning himself to be careful, yet his focus remained on finishing the round trip as planned. The wind grew stronger, and the exposed terrain made it increasingly difficult to stay upright. Then came a moment that would haunt those who watched, forever. Tetsu paused at a particularly steep slope, the ropeway ending just ahead. The ground beneath him was solid ice, and there was nothing to hold on to. He laughed nervously as he nearly fell, brushing off the close call. But seconds later, he slipped again. This time, there was no recovery. As he slid down the icy slope, his phone remained connected to the live stream, capturing the final moments of his life. The stream went dark when the phone struck a rock. But by then, it was too late. Tetsu had fallen from the mountain's edge, plummeting 2,300 feet, or 700 meters, before his body came to a violent stop. For 2 days, rescue teams searched for him, scouring the mountainside for any sign of the fallen climber. It wasn't until October 30th, at 1:40 p.m., that a body was found just below the 7th station of the Subashiri Trail. The face was so damaged that it was impossible to determine the gender, and the lower half of the body was missing. A backpack found nearby provided no clues to the identity, but the police suspected it was Tetsu Shiohara. Their suspicions were confirmed 13 days later. Tetsu had indeed fallen to his death, his body battered and broken by the unforgiving mountain. There remains online debate about his intentions that day, whether he was simply reckless or if he was seeking something more profound in his final climb. Mount Fuji, a place of beauty and reverence, became the stage for Tetsu's final act, a tragic tale of a man searching for meaning in a world that had left him behind. In the end, even the goddess Sakuya Hime, if she was watching, could not prevent his fate.